Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. From our last class, we have talked about the introduction to conservation, and we also discussed about various principles of conservation. And today we are going to discuss about, from the series of lectures on why I'm using this as a learning from vernacular. Obviously, from our beginning of the course, we did discuss about the various classifications of vernacular, and we talked about various challenges on how, because there is a deep connection between the way the vernacular studies and the heritage conservation. So I'm trying to see how an architects and the built environment professionals, how they can connect from, how they can learn from from the vernacular, and how there is a process of unlearning also takes place simultaneously. And today I'll be I'll introducing you to the idea of the criteria of how the World Heritage listing happens, especially for which are the properties that are in danger. And in fact, UNESCO is one of the prime organizations which takes the holistic look into identifying the heritage and understanding the outstanding universal value of this heritage, and how we can actually categorize them, and what is the criterion laid out in order to categorize into the listing process. So through a 2-year consultation process, they have identified about 14 prime factors affecting the outstanding universal value of the World Heritage properties. So I'm giving the link also, the World Heritage, whc.unesco.org. So if one can go into that website, the whole website navigates you into the different types of heritage all over the world, and what are the brief description of it, what are the indicators into it, and the relevant videos and the relevant conservation efforts taken into that particular property or in the premises or in that region. So that gives you a very holistic understanding to get what is happening. Now, as we talked about the 14 prime factors, the first one is the buildings and development. For instance, especially when there is a heritage context involved, obviously the growth and expansion of any urban sprawl, or what happens when skyscrapers come around the heritage precincts, so how it dominates the whole precincts, and also the industrial areas, because the whole new setting is defined, and which can overlook or which can have a potential of damaging the heritage context and its integrity. And even if you consider the major tourist attractions which were developed for any kind of religious precincts which has a communal and a social value in it, and so there is always various facilities. Basically, it could be a tourism development, it could be infrastructural oriented, and some of the interpretative and visitation facilities, because the moment you have a nice landscape features or a heritage, so the moment you start up with the picnic facilities, recreational facilities, which might have an impact of threatening some kind of posing some threats to that heritage property. So how to have a control of this, and how we can act upon it, how we can carefully think while planning for the regional development and as well as the local development. Transportation and infrastructure. So it could be ranging from ground transport infrastructure, imagining you are talking about a metro corridors. So what happens to the heritage structures? So how it could be due to the construction, it could be the visibility of that. So how this whole infrastructural connectivity also hinders or lessen the impact, create some impact on the heritage structures. It could be a marine transport infrastructure. For example, today we are discussing about Ram Setu bridge, which connects from the India to Sri Lanka, and there is still a legal procedure, legal hearings, and a lot of this was going on from years and years. So it is whether the Rama, we call it as the Adams Bridge, has been laid by Rama or not, or so how the mythological stories have some deeper connection. It is in a way there is raising certain conflicts in certain marine infrastructures. Also, it could be from air transport infrastructures. How about if you're planning an airport or any other thing next to the heritage context? So what kind of acoustical issues are there, what kind of the development issues are there. And not only that, underground transport infrastructure. When we talk about, let's say for example, like one of the good projects, we talk about the crossrail.co.uk, which is one of the major infrastructure underground, how it connects to East and West London, and even any kind of tube network, which are, and it talks about the moment you are talking about planning of any stations, and how it will have an orientation towards the heritage structures which are already existing, and which will have an implications on this. So all these things also causes certain threats. Utilities or service infrastructure. We also talked about a case of Kiruna, where they decided of moving the city from A to B. Obviously, service implications are there. So it could be by dams. Imagine if for irrigation purposes, if a dam is proposed in a particular area or in a particular villages, some few villages have to be relocated, and imagine some historic temples will be submerged underwater. So obviously there are some, that is how even because of certain constructions, there might be some areas which can be inundated, or it could be flood threats. They might get threats from the floods. So it also could be because of any non-renewable and renewable energy facilities, and it could be by the cell phone towers. So in the present, if you look at this whole decade from the millennium, how the mobile phones have changed the whole world and the human habitats. In few cities, wherever you see, all the terraces are filled with towers, antennas, solar. So how it will also create some kind of impact on the aesthetic quality of that particular heritage context. And one of the important part is the pollution. When we talk about pollution of marine waters, how about an ecosystem, how a natural heritage, a very rich, sensitive ecosystems, how they get degraded because of various industrial pollution, various tourism activities, and also the surface water pollution, the acid rains, and the air pollution. How today we are talking about Taj Mahal, how it is treated because of the surrounding industrial smog, and how it is taking out its color, and how it is fading its color. So there are various concerns of even the heritage properties, especially with this, and with this kind of development issues. Solid waste. So tomorrow a new development takes place, and the whole solid waste system has been located at one corner of a heritage precincts. Obviously it will bring some kind of negative impacts to the people, to the visitors, and to the property itself. Biological resources. So obviously there are a lot of biological, the aquaculture, change of farming lands to the aquaculture, and change of land ownership, and the land usage basically, and the land conversion from rural to the urban areas. So how this all will make an impact on the heritage. In fact, there are many evidences, and today we'll be also discussing about one of the heritage locations in Yemen, where how the massive urbanization processes also creates an impact on some of the heritage settlements. The crop productions. Imagine a particular family. Though it might be a monument, but if the community has a value has certain value to that particular monument, and there are certain associated meanings which were developed. But if their livelihood is affected through the climate change or the crop production, obviously it will also indirectly affect their values and meanings. Physical resource extraction, it could be mining or quarrying, how they also have an impact on the heritage. It could be an oil and gas and water extraction. So also the local conditions, how they affect, like the temperature, the radiation, the dust, the pollutions, water, and the pest, especially for timber structures, the pest is, the kind of termites, how it come, and because there's all the local conditions. Social and cultural uses of heritage, how the society values the heritage. Like, for instance, indigenous hunting, gathering, and collecting. For instance, we are talking about the tigers population. So how these tribes, how we can also have a balance of the hunting practices, and as well as the rare resources of such as tigers, and changes in traditional ways of life and knowledge systems. So how they were relying on, and how the modern interventions have changed. And that is how the social cohesions, especially when different communities like refugees or anyone who comes into the setup, and how they consider the value of it, and how there is a conflict, and how there is a little social cohesion, changes in local population community. So that actually talks about the migration patterns and their identity, how the identity builds upon. So impacts of tourism, visitor, and recreation. In fact, I could like to give you some idea. There was a film of Three Idiots, an Indian Bollywood film. There was a nice shot which was taken in somewhere near Ladakh, where in the last climax scene. But now, because of the film component, after that it has become more of a tourism place, and then people started throwing maza bottles, cool drink bottles, and rubbish. It become like a kind of garbage yard, the holistic place, and it's a very ecologically sensitive areas. And how people tend to behave with these particular premises is also a major concern. So other human activities like encroachments and deliberate destruction of heritage. In fact, we talked about certain Babri Masjid issues where there's a conflict of heritage conflicts of representation and identity, and vandalism, graffiti. Also, it could be also politically motivated because of various reasons. And the military training, war, I think we did discussed about in the Hitler's case, and even how power mediates with the built form. Terrorism, like that is because they're all fighting for identity, cultural identity. Climate change, and it could be a natural strike, a lightning strike, which might damage, like what you have seen in Nepal. During the recent earthquake, the whole heritage property has been, the Darbar Square has been demolished and destructed, and that has a huge loss. It's not only a building destruction, but it also talks about many values and many belief systems that has been affected. So it could be also sudden ecological and geological events. It could be due to tsunami. In the tsunami case also we talked about the Tarangambadi case, where the Masilimani Nada temple has been destroyed, and how after that certain restoration activities taken on. Wildfires, so there's also the natural phenomenon to it. Like in places like Ayutthaya in Thailand, how the floodplain, there's a natural floods which affects these heritage areas. And also there are some invasive and alien species of hyper-abundant species, weeds and invertebrate pests, fish pests, diseases. So there are various reasons for these kind of threats. And Apart from the natural and the political processes, there are also the management and institutional factors. What kind of legal framework that operates within a country, within a national level and at the local level, and what kind of surveys, what kind of sampling they have done, what kind of governance management systems, and also how they can monitor the research, like in the case of Bhojpur, when they identified the maps on the which are actually embossed on the floor, on the rocky surface. So how to protect these surfaces, because then they tried covering it, but then little more research is needed. What are the appropriate ways of protecting this? And financial resources. Today we have fund to protect, but tomorrow if we don't, then obviously how about the continuity aspect of it, and the human resources? Who does what, and what is their roles? So, and also other factors which are not from this list. So in order to be included on the World Heritage List, the sites must be of outstanding universal value. So that is one of the important. It's not that my building or your building, it has to possess that outstanding universal value and meet at least 1 out of 10 selection criteria. I mean, I'm giving you a website name if one can actually go through it and look at it. So these criteria have also been laid out in certain operational guidelines for the implementation of World Heritage Convention. So I just brief out the criteria. In fact, the one talks about to represent a masterpiece of human creative genius, to exhibit an important interchange of human values over a span of time or within a cultural area of the world, and developments in architecture or technology, monumental arts, town planning or landscape design. So today we are talking about Chandigarh, today we are talking about, because some of the why Chandigarh has been also recently listed, and then similarly in the old historic layouts, how the town planning principles have been understood to bear a unique or at least exceptionally testimony to the cultural tradition or to a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. So whether it is lasting now or it has already disappeared, so there's still these evidences also be one of the criteria. To be an outstanding example of a type of a building, architectural or technological ensemble or landscape which illustrates significant stages in human history. In fact, in Sweden, for example, the Gammelstad church, which is again a heritage, so the whole church is built with a random rubble masonry. It was a huge church. So it talks about its the nature of the building construction and the type of building and the kind of technology which how it was being made of that time. The fifth one is about to be the outstanding example of a traditional human settlement, land use or sea use, which is representative of a culture or human interaction with the environment, especially when it becomes vulnerable under the impact of irreversible change. So in fact, how these particular tribal settlements, or if there is any ecologically sensitive settlements, so how they are also prone to certain dangers, certain threats. So that is also one of the criteria. To be directly or tangibly associated with events or living traditions, with ideas or with beliefs, with artistic and literary works of outstanding universal significance. So basically, even the intangible, how they are actually associated with the how these tangible elements are associated with the intangible elements, including their ideas or the belief systems or the artistic and even the literary works. To contain the superlative natural phenomena of areas of exceptional natural beauty. We talked about some of the areas in Australian continent, how they are exceptionally beautiful. Even the Cappadocia, we talk about the whole Cappadocia, which is kind of the molten lava and how it has been formed. So there's all talks about certain aesthetic importance, certain geological importance. To be outstanding examples representing major stages of Earth's history. We talked about some of the evolutions of especially the Pitalgora caves, how the volcanic movements and how they settle down stage by stage and how they evolved into the human history. The record of life, significant, of the Bhimbetka caves, which we discussed earlier. in the development of landforms or significant geomorphic and physiographic features. Cappadocia is also one of the good examples. To be outstanding examples representing significant ongoing ecological and biological processes in the evolution and development of terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, or marine ecosystems. The reefs, the great reefs, the coastal reefs, they're all part of this particular criterion. To contain the most important and significant natural habitats for in situ conservation and biological, including those contain the threatened species of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science or conservation. So these are a very broad list of 10 criteria, out of which, as we mentioned, at least 1 out of 10 selection criteria it should follow. And I'm giving a reference of this particular document of operational guidelines for implementation of World Heritage Convention. So one can actually go through. There's also a list of the formats on how one can document it. So I give you an example of the earthen constructions, especially if one talks about earthen constructions. It's not just about a site we have to look about it. It's about how geologically it's spread, how the earthen buildings have been, earth architecture spread throughout the world. In fact, if you see all shaded part, which is mostly you'll find in the Middle Eastern and the northwest of India, the Middle Eastern, Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Iran, and as well as parts of Africa on this west coast of South America and the Mexico. So even parts of Australia and desert. So you'll find most of the earthen architecture, because earth is locally, the adobe, the mud is locally available in these part of the region. That is how people have developed. And I'll give you a good example of old walled city of Shibam. In fact, if you look at this photograph, this whole settlement is a high-rise settlement. It is often referred as Manhattan of the desert, and the whole construction is built with mud. Can you imagine that this whole settlement is built with mud? Because today it is also unimaginable, even just with mud, how people have built up to 7 to 9 storied buildings. So this is also one of the listed in the list, in list number, in the page. I've given you a link here. And in fact, this is, the whole settlement is a surrounded by a fortified wall, and it dates back to 3rd century AD, and then mostly the prominent development happened from 16th century. And this city of Shibam is one of the oldest and best examples of urban planning based on the principle of vertical construction. And most of this, today we are talking about apartments. They're all like a tower-like structures rise out of the cliff and have given the city the nickname of Manhattan of the desert. So this is how it looks, the whole mud architecture. It's one of the perfect example of how they have made the kind of more skyscrapers model, and how the indigenous resources have developed. In fact, the 16th century walled city, this actually rised out from the edge of Wadi Hadramaut, and this is always referred as Manhattan or Chicago of the desert. So this is located at Yemen, and the important caravan halt on the spice and incense route. There's always a spice route. So how the trade routes have actually also created certain stopover, the halt places. So this is the spice and incense route across the southern Arabian plateau. So this is mostly from 7 to 9 storied, developed on a fortified rectangular grid plan of streets and squares. The city is built on a rocky spur several hundred meters above the wadi bed. So basically there is a wadi bed and it's raised above. And the earlier settlement that was actually destroyed by a massive flood somewhere in 1532. So even the mosque, the religious, because being an Islamic settlement, the Friday mosque dates back from 9th to 10th century, and the castle from 13th century. But the evidence is talk that this particular settlement, earlier settlement, originated from the pre-Islamic period. So soon it became the capital of Hadramaut after the destruction of the earlier capital of Shabwa in 300 AD, which was located further to the west along the Wadi. And in the very late 19th century, these traders returning from Asia regenerated the walled city, and since then the development has expanded to the southern bank of the Wadi, forming a new suburb, Al Sahil. So how this particular, because now you understood how the growth have occurred, it took some centuries, like if you are talking from the Friday Mosque, 9th, which dates back to 9th and 10th century, and the fort of 13th century, and the whole stories of 16th to 19th century. But gradually how the abandonment of the old agricultural food management systems, that is what we discussed in the one of the threats component in the Wadi, because there's a threats component of this food management systems and overloading of traditional sanitary systems by the introduction of modern water supply combined with inadequate drainage together with changes in the livestock management have all contributed to the decay of the city. So it is not just, so there is a service orientation here, there is a livelihood orientation reason for it, there is a service reason for it, and gradually how this has put in abandoned and a decay of how they have contributed to the decay of the city. So I'll just show you some videos of this.
The Manhattan of the desert, the old walled city of Shibam. Yemen is on the southern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. The city of Shibam is characterized by numerous mud brick buildings huddled closely together. Many high-rise buildings were built like this to protect it from Bedouin attacks. A defensive wall and 2 city gates protect the city. Clusters of 5 to 8-story buildings stand closely together in a small area. Some of the houses are linked by mid-air corridors. People can quickly move between the corridors, shifting from one house to another and fighting back when attacked by enemies. Wooden window frames fitted to mud-plastered walls are carved in an arch shape. The history of Shibam dates back to the 3rd century. However, the buildings which remain today are mostly from the 16th century. But how did this city attain so much wealth that people had to fear and prepare for enemy attacks? The secret lies in frankincense, which is still sold in the town. A bucket is being lifted up for house repair work. Earthen walls need to be replastered every now and then after erosion from wind and rain. These craftsmen are making bricks. The bricks become gradually smaller for the higher floors, which means the building walls gradually become thinner, forming a trapezium shape. The walls are thinner on higher floors to reduce the pressure on lower floors, making the building strong and stable. Each building is usually occupied by one family, which uses the 3rd floor up as its residence. The 1st and 2nd floors are often used to store food and as a stable for livestock. People kept cattle inside their homes to live through times when the town was under attack. The earthen houses stay cool inside despite the heat outside. The aroma of frankincense filling the room creates an exotic atmosphere. In the Manhattan of the desert, people live in a state of timelessness.
So there's another video which is about the rehabilitation process of which has also nominated for Aga Khan Award.
Known by some as the Manhattan of the desert, Shibam is a walled city of vertical high-rise buildings soaring up to 30 meters out of the sands of Wadi Hadramaut in southeastern Yemen. It's an urban masterpiece. Incredibly, these 7- and 8-story towers were built 500 years ago, long before concrete and steel, using the area's most common material, mud from nearby riverbeds. But mud is a building material that needs regular maintenance. Even in Yemen's arid environment, mud brick construction can become fragile if left unchecked for long periods. With many of Shibam's inhabitants leaving their homes in search of a more convenient lifestyle, a large number of buildings were suffering the effects of abandonment. Shibam was on its way to becoming a ghost town, its labyrinthine streets and lanes wind-blown and empty. A magnificent slice of Yemen's culture at risk, quite literally, of crumbling to dust. But over the past 20 years, a number of agencies and individuals have committed time and resources to restoring Shibam, not as a museum for tourists, but as a living city. The most recent of these programmes is the Shibam Urban Development Project, established in the year 2000. Co-financed by the governments of Yemen and Germany, the project started with an ambition to show that restoring heritage is one of the best means of bringing benefits to Shibam's inhabitants. The Shibam project has already repaired and restored nearly 200 houses. Some have had windows replaced, some entire roofs or frontages. The results are plain to see.
What we have been able to achieve over the last few years is not simply an improved housing stock, but the fact that people's attitude towards the city has changed. What has been achieved more than the bricks and mortar and mud renders is the fact that people themselves believe in it.
So you have just watched a brief about how the Shibam settlement and what kind of conservation efforts have been taken up by the agencies. So what we see is, first of all, the indigenous way of living, it is also a kind of defensive strategies, how this whole vertical towers have been developed, because on the third floor they start living and then they have the storage areas for living in the ground floor and first floor and second floor. But they also have a kind of connecting corridors. If some attackers come, then how they can move around and how. So this is a way how man have developed indigenously for his needs, for his surviving needs. So it also, because the conservation process, not just talking about only a building, it's not about only the lime and the mortar or a mud. It also talks about the attitude, how the change in the attitude and how they have respect towards that traditional knowledge, and then how it can be enhanced, because that can give a longer self-reliance and maintenance aspect. So one of the criteria which this particular Shibam falls on criteria 3, 4 and 5, and in fact it talks about the defensive character of Shibam with its dense conglomeration of many storied buildings with almost no fenestration at ground level is an exceptional testimony to the strong competition that existed between rival families over this region. So the kind of defensive character. And while the highly homogeneous society traces its roots to Shibam over centuries, the traditional way of life exemplified by the city and its tower houses threatened by social and economic changes. That is what kind of livelihood changes have it happened. So that reflects to bear a unique or at least exceptional testimony to the cultural tradition or a civilization which is living or which has disappeared. And similarly, it is one of the best examples of urban planning and based on multi-storied construction. And it represents the most accomplished example of traditional Hadrami urban architecture, both in a grid layout of its streets and squares, but the visual impact of its form rising out from the floodplain of the Wadi. So these whole process, this whole form, they indicate the kind of key period from 16th to 19th century, where the local traders developed the economic and political prestige through travel and trade abroad. So in the criterion 5, it is also as an outstanding example of traditional human settlement, land use and sea use. So basically it's one of the important contribution, and which is a surviving, and so there is always setting preserve the last surviving and comprehensive evidence of a traditional society that has adapted to the precarious life of spate agricultural environment. So as we said, it is also continuously through having threats with the social and economic changes and to the annual flood. So if you summarize the whole thing, it's basically the threats are from natural elements, lack of organizational support, and material resources for conservation. Because where do we find the skilled labor? How the skill is gradually deteriorating. Threats related to armed conflict. So that is how there's few notes which I just flipped through is the integrity. What is the integrity? Because on one side we also talked about the functioning relationship and how it's still intact and deserves protection. And at the same time, these integrity and authenticity are under threat of floods. So I end this lecture, and in the coming lecture we will take another examples of, because now we are talking more of a settlement level. Thank you very much.